Making My Brain. This is a lecture by Andrew Thomas for the One School 4 module, which I want you to watch by Monday the 6th of November. So, we've talked a lot about who I am in terms of knowledge about me. Now we're going to look a little bit more philosophically about what kind of person am I, what kind of thing is a me, what kind of thing is a human. And specifically, we're going to look at the brain, which is a curious thing, because when you look at it in terms of the body, it's the center of the body. But when you look inside the brain, there is no center, and that's partly because the brain acts on itself. And this is the concept of Catherine Malabou of plasticity, which is an aesthetic concept. Plasticity is all about changing something. And self-plasticity is, of course, when you are changing your brain into something else, something that it wasn't before, but it will shortly become. And it happens in a lot of ways. Firstly, the example a lot of people refer to is that of taxi drivers. You can change your brain by habits. There are some experiments or observations that have been made on the brain scan of taxi drivers. And it's not just that we know taxi drivers know maps really well, or particularly map of the town that they work in. But actually, when you observe the physical brain of a taxi driver, some bits of that brain, where the map is kept, are simply much bigger than other people's. So it's not because they are born that way. Future taxi drivers might not have that, but then they develop it, and it's because they have changed their brains. Not done on purpose. They've not kind of opened up their skull and kind of squeezed a little bit so that the other bit will get bigger. I know it's Halloween, but that's not what we're talking about. What happens is that by doing something a great number of times, you exercise bits of your brain. The neurons change, and things grow in ways in particular areas where other areas perhaps don't grow so much. The same is true of musicians, all sorts of things. Our brains are simply very different from each other. They're not the kind of symmetrical, constant things that we could imagine from brains. Everybody's brain is different, obviously, but everybody's brain is shaped differently as well. So that's one of the aspects of plasticity. We change our brains by our habits. We know that it happens, and we can observe it, but we can't really feel it. You can't just go, oh, my brain is changing now. We might be aware that we want to change our habits, but we can't necessarily say, now I'm going to go and change my brain. I'll be back in 5 minutes. So that's one of the ways in which we change our brain. The other aspect is the chemical, another way which is very familiar to us, of course, is chemical ways in which we change our brains. There are lots of them. I'm just choosing a couple today, and this has also been known for a very great time. In fact, at the end of the 17th century, the philosopher John Locke wrote about the situation. What about if a man has gone out to a party and got so drunk that he has no memory the day afterwards of what he's done? If he does something wrong, okay, or which is illegal, for example, and he gets caught, can he then rightly be brought to trial, even though he has no memory? What is the point of punishing the morning after man who has no idea and certainly wouldn't do any of the things that the party animal the night before actually did do? Point is, John Locke's saying that memory is a central part of our brain, and these days it raises all sorts of difficult questions about what is it that makes us the same person over time, and also historical questions of what kind of parties was John Locke going to. More importantly, though, the point is that when it comes to the law, it's perhaps easier in some chemical when our brain is in certain chemical states. Easier for us to commit crimes than it is when they're in other ones. And we actually know that we actually have some rather disturbing correlations between drug taking and criminals, and criminality, and other obviously important protests which say that there is no necessary connection. Point being, of course, that the chemicals that we admit into our brain actually change our behavior. So not only does our behavior change our brain, but our brain changes our behavior. obviously, but we can also change our brains directly through chemicals. So we are the ones that decide it. We take the alcohol or whatever it is, the chemical that we're taking into our brain, and we have no other intention in taking that except to change our brain, and we feel our brain actually changing, or we feel our behavior patterns changing. So that's one other way in which we make our brain, we make our future. Okay, what is it that we make our brain into? So granted that we have an influence not only on what we do, but we also have an influence on what kind of decisions we're going to make in the future. This is not just we have responsibility for our decisions. Obviously, everybody has a responsibility for every single decision they make, but we also have a responsibility for what future decisions and what families of future decisions we're going to make. So we can choose to make our brain a more flexible or a more creative or a more obedient or a more passive thing. Our brain is something that we can mold in concrete and real ways, and we haven't gone into the issues of meditation or mental practices, but essentially pedagogy is all about molding your brain in the future. And there are lots of ways in which obviously you can change your brain, and sometimes it goes in ways that we don't necessarily expect to. But what kind of ideals we have will be reflected in what kind of changes we make to our brain and how we learn to make those changes, of course. And sometimes it's completely unpredictable. You could, for example, make your brain into something which is flexible, which is to say you react to whatever requirements are made on your brain at the time. And then those requirements could be made by anyone in theory. It could be your requirements. Today I want to eat only bread and choose only bread and not eat any fruit at all. Whereas tomorrow I'm only going to eat fruit. These are all the things that you can just say, I want this in the future. But you could also, but flexibility also means that other people's requirements you'll be able to adapt to. And if we look into school, into the way of schooling and school ideals, adaptation, which we've talked about in terms of adapting teaching to the pupils, could actually go both ways, and we could require our pupils to adapt to the school system, and we've talked about that as well. So we have to remember that these things actually take place in terms of our brains, and Catherine Malibu makes this extremely important point that that flexibility could go both ways, and developing flexible brains will make society easier to govern, because people can flex into the new situation that into which they find themselves. So flexible brains are easier to govern than non-flexible ones. It's also true that that this plasticity, the way we change our brain, it's something. It doesn't mean that it is definitely elastic from before or flexible from before. Brains don't necessarily always whip back into place. The way we change our brains, will sometimes you get a hangover and everything's better again the next day, and in some respects they are just changed from now on. Changing your brain is a historical thing. You change your story by changing your brain, which means it's more significant than simply my decision as to how much drink I'm going to have this evening. Sometimes it can go disastrously wrong. So we make our brain, we are forming our brain by either taking chemicals or not taking chemicals, by either making particular disciplinary exercises or not. We're making our future brain whether we like it or not, and we make these decisions. Are we responsible for these decisions? Are we responsible for future changes? That's a good question to ask. What kind of skills do we want our future brains to have? That kind of question is going to affect what kind of exercises we're going to put it through. But ultimately, the kind of brains that we form for our future lives are also the kind of societies that we want to live in. So that makes it a question that I need to ask you, you need to ask me, and we all need to ask our political communities.